It was a typical Wednesday afternoon in a quiet little town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalks as kids made their way home from school. Among them was a 16-year-old girl with a backpack slung over one shoulder and headphones resting loosely around her neck. She wasn't paying much attention to anything beyond the rhythm of her steps, just another ordinary day. But then, something changed. A police car rolled slowly down the street behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe they were patrolling the area or looking for someone else. But when the cruiser slowed even more and stayed right behind her, she started to feel uneasy. Her pace quickened instinctively, her sneakers hitting the pavement a little harder now. Still, the car followed. Finally, it pulled over to the curb, and an officer stepped out. "Hey you," he called, his voice sharp enough to make her freeze mid-step. Heart pounding, she turned around to face him. "Yeah, you," he said again, walking toward her. "Do you know anything about a stolen bike?" Her eyes widened. "What? No. I don't even own a bike." The officer crossed his arms, sizing her up. "Really? Then why were you running when I pulled up?" "I wasn't running. I was just walking faster because—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain that his presence had made her nervous. He smirked, clearly not buying it. Sure. And I guess your dad's some big-shot hero who'll come save you, huh?" His tone dripped with sarcasm, and she felt heat rising in her cheeks. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was frustration. Why wouldn't he believe her? She tried explaining again, but he cut her off, telling her to get into the patrol car so they could sort this out at the station. As she sat in the backseat, staring out the window, her mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She hadn't done anything wrong. All she wanted was to go home, eat dinner, and forget about this nightmare. But deep down, she knew things weren't going to end there. Later, after hours of sitting in a cold, sterile room at the station, she finally got the chance to use the phone. Her hands shook as she dialed her father's number. Each ring felt like an eternity. When he finally picked up, relief washed over her, but only for a moment. As soon as she started recounting what happened, his voice hardened. "Don't worry," he said firmly. "I'm coming." Little did the officer know, this wasn't just any parent showing up to defend their kid. This was someone who had spent years training to handle situations exactly like this, one where fairness mattered most. And once he arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. Back on the other side of the world, thousands of miles away, a man sat in a dimly lit room going over maps and reports. His day had been long, filled with briefings, strategy sessions, and decisions that carried weight far beyond what most people could imagine. But when his phone buzzed on the table, everything else faded into the background. He glanced at the screen and saw it was his daughter calling. Normally, hearing from her brought a smile to his face. She always had stories about school, her friends, or some new idea she was excited about. This time, though, something felt different. Her name flashing on the screen sent a jolt through him, and he answered immediately. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm but tinged with concern. "What's going on?" The sound of her voice hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the cheerful tone he was used to. It was shaky, quiet, and laced with fear. He leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter as she began to explain what had happened. Every word she spoke made his chest tighten. By the time she finished, his jaw was clenched so hard it hurt. "They did what?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. She hesitated before answering. They accused me of stealing a bike, Dad. I swear I didn't do anything wrong." They wouldn't listen to me. And then her voice cracked. "And then the officer said something about you being some kind of hero who'd come save me. Like it was a joke." For a moment, there was silence on the line. The man closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He knew how strong his daughter was. She got that from him. But even the strongest people could feel small when treated unfairly, especially by someone who was supposed to protect them. "I'm coming home," he said firmly. "But Dad, you're overseas. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll figure it out. Don't worry about me. Just tell me where you are right now." She gave him the address of the police station, her voice trembling as she described the situation again. He listened carefully, asking questions and making mental notes. When the call ended, he wasted no time. Years of training had taught him how to act quickly under pressure, and this was no exception. First, he contacted his commanding officer, explaining the urgency of the situation. To his relief, they understood. Within hours, he was granted emergency leave and boarded the first available flight back to the States. Sitting in the cramped airplane seat, staring out the window at the clouds below, his mind raced. He replayed every detail his daughter had told him, piecing together what might have gone wrong. By the time the plane touched down, he was exhausted but focused. He grabbed his bag, hailed a cab, and headed straight to the police station. On the way, he thought about all the times he taught his daughter to stand up for herself, to speak her truth even when others doubted her. Now it was his turn to do the same for her. When the taxi pulled up outside the station, he took a moment to collect himself. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. For anyone watching, he looked calm and composed, but inside he was a storm of emotions: anger, frustration, and above all, determination. He walked toward the entrance, his mind clear about one thing: no matter what it took, he was going to make sure his daughter got justice. And if that meant facing down whoever had wronged her, so be it. As he pushed open the door to the station, he didn't know exactly what awaited him. What he did know was this: he wasn't just any father showing up to defend his child. He was someone who had spent his entire life fighting for fairness, honor, and respect. And today, those values were more important than ever. The bell above the police station door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clatter of keys on a keyboard. A few officers sat at desks scattered around the space, some typing reports, others chatting casually. No one paid much attention to him at first, just another person walking through the door, probably here for a routine matter. But that changed the moment he approached the front desk. The officer sitting there looked up lazily, clearly expecting a mundane question or request. Instead, he was met with a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. There was something about the way he carried himself, his posture straight, his movements deliberate, that made people take notice. "I need to speak with the officer who detained my daughter," he said, his voice calm but firm. The desk officer blinked, caught off guard by the intensity in his tone. Can I have your name, sir?" He didn't hesitate. "You can call me her father. Now, tell me which one of your colleagues decided it was okay to accuse her of something she didn't do." The desk officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, we'll need more information before." Before the sentence could finish, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal an ID card and a set of medals pinned neatly inside. The desk officer's eyes widened as he scanned the credentials. His expression shifted from casual indifference to nervous curiosity. "Do you know what this means?" the man asked, his voice still steady but carrying a weight that silenced the room. The desk officer stammered, "Why, yes, sir, of course. Let me find out who handled the case." Word spread quickly among the officers in the station. Whispers rippled through the air as they realized who had just walked in. This wasn't just any parent coming to complain. It was someone who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting others. Someone who knew exactly how authority should and shouldn't be used. Minutes later, the officer involved in the incident appeared, looking confused and slightly uneasy. When he saw the man standing at the front desk, his confusion turned to recognition. "Sir, I assume you're here about your daughter," he began, attempting to sound professional. The man turned to face him, his gaze unwavering. "That's right. You accused her of stealing a bike. Care to explain why?" The officer swallowed hard, suddenly aware that all eyes in the room were on him. "We had a report of a stolen bike, and she matched the description." She matched the description. The man interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "What does that even mean? Did you bother to ask her any questions, or did you just decide she was guilty because it was easier?" The officer fumbled for words. I followed protocol, sir. I couldn't just ignore the report." "Protocol?" The man raised an eyebrow, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Is mocking a teenager part of your protocol? Telling her that her dad must be some kind of hero coming to save her, is that standard procedure too?" The room fell silent. The officer's face flushed red, and he glanced around nervously, hoping for backup that never came. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice but keeping it sharp. "Let me tell you something. I've spent years risking my life for people like you. And now, I'm here to make sure my daughter gets treated the way she deserves, with fairness and respect. So, are you going to apologize, or am I going to have to remind you what accountability looks like?" For the first time in his career, the officer found himself speechless. The man's words weren't loud or threatening. They were measured, controlled, and full of conviction. It was clear he wasn't bluffing. Whatever happened next, everyone in the room knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to end quietly. As the tension hung thick in the air, the man stood his ground, waiting for the officer to respond. Behind him, his daughter watched silently, her heart swelling with pride and relief. Her dad hadn't just shown up, he had arrived ready to fight for her. And nothing was going to stop him now. The officer stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of what to say next. The man didn't give him much time to think. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out his phone, tapping it a few times before holding it up for the officer to see. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his tone calm but unyielding. On the screen was a picture of medals, rows of them, gleaming under bright lights. Beneath that were certificates and commendations, each one marking years of sacrifice, discipline, and service. The officer squinted at the images, his face growing paler with every second. "This isn't just some random guy showing up to yell at you," the man continued. "This is someone who has spent decades protecting people like ***. People who sit behind desks or wear uniforms and expect respect without earning it. And now, here I am, dealing with the fact that you treated my daughter like she was worthless." His voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words hit harder than any shout ever could. The room stayed silent, everyone frozen in place. Even the sound of papers shuffling or chairs creaking had stopped. It was as if the entire station was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer finally found his voice, though it came out shaky. "Sir, I wasn't trying to disrespect her. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" The man's eyebrows shot up. "Let me tell you something about jobs. My job involves making life or death decisions in situations most people couldn't even imagine. And yet, when I'm done with those missions, I come home and teach my daughter how to treat others with kindness and fairness. Because that's what real authority looks like. Not bullying kids because they're easy targets." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced around the room again, hoping someone might step in, but no one moved. The desk sergeant who had greeted the man earlier kept his head down, pretending to focus on paperwork. Other officers avoided eye contact altogether. The man took a step closer, his presence looming over the officer now. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice dropping lower but still carrying enough force to echo through the room. "You're going to apologize to my daughter, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how you treated an innocent kid, starting with your chief." The officer swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He turned toward the girl standing quietly nearby, watching everything unfold. She looked small compared to the towering figures of her father and the officer, but there was strength in her eyes. I'm sorry," the officer muttered, his voice barely audible. "For what?" The man pressed, refusing to let him off the hook so easily. For accusing you without evidence," the officer stammered, looking directly at the girl this time. "And for saying things I shouldn't have." She nodded slowly, accepting the apology without saying a word. Her father, however, wasn't satisfied yet. "That's a start," he said, turning back to the officer. "But we're not done here. You work for the public, which means you answer to us. If you want to keep wearing that badge, you'd better learn how to use it properly. Got it?" "Yes, sir," the officer replied quickly, nodding vigorously. Satisfied, for now, the man stepped back, giving the officer space to retreat. But he made it clear that this wasn't the end of the conversation, not by a long shot. As the tension in the room began to ease, whispers started up again among the officers. Some looked impressed, others seemed uneasy. One thing was certain, none of them would forget this moment anytime soon. The man turned to his daughter, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly, his tone changing completely from the steeliness he'd shown moments ago. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yeah, Dad, thanks to you." He gave her a small smile, pulling her into a hug. For a brief moment, the chaos of the day melted away, replaced by the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. But as they walked out of the station together, the man knew their fight wasn't over. Apologies were nice, but actions mattered more. And he wasn't about to let anyone slide, not when it came to justice for his child. After leaving the police station, the man didn't go straight home. Instead, he sat with his daughter in a quiet park nearby, letting her take a moment to breathe. She looked exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from the ordeal she'd been through. He stayed by her side, offering silent support while she processed everything that had happened. But as much as he wanted to give her space to heal, he also knew they couldn't let this slide. What had happened wasn't just about her. It was part of something bigger, something systemic. And if they didn't push for accountability now, it would only keep happening to someone else. "Listen," he said finally, breaking the silence between them. "I know today was rough, but we can't stop here. That officer owes you more than just an apology. The whole department needs to understand what went wrong so it doesn't happen again." She nodded slowly, her eyes still red from crying. "I get it, Dad. But how do we even start? They're not just going to admit they messed up." He smiled faintly, leaning back against the bench. "Oh, trust me, they will. Because when people don't want to listen, sometimes you have to make them." The next morning, he made some calls. First, he reached out to old contacts, friends who worked in law enforcement or advocacy groups focused on fairness and justice. He explained the situation, asking for advice on how to hold the department accountable without causing unnecessary drama. Then, he requested copies of any evidence related to the incident, surveillance footage, witness statements, anything that could prove his daughter's innocence. By the end of the day, he had gathered enough material to build a solid case. But he didn't stop there. Knowing that public attention often forced institutions to act, he decided to share their story responsibly. He helped his daughter write a detailed account of what had happened, focusing on the facts rather than emotions. Together, they posted it online, tagging local news outlets and community organizations. Within hours, the post went viral. People were outraged, not just because of what had happened to her, but because it resonated with similar experiences shared by countless others. Soon, reporters started calling. At first, he hesitated, unsure if putting themselves in the spotlight was the right move. But after talking it over with his daughter, they agreed. If sharing their story could prevent another kid from being treated unfairly, it was worth it. So, they sat down for interviews, speaking openly about the incident and its impact. Their words struck a chord, sparking conversations about bias, accountability, and reform within the police force. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on the department. Calls poured in from concerned citizens demanding answers. Local leaders weighed in, calling for transparency and action. Faced with mounting scrutiny, the police chief scheduled a meeting with the family to discuss next steps. When the man walked into the room alongside his daughter, flanked by a lawyer he brought along for good measure, the chief looked visibly uneasy. "We appreciate you coming in," the chief began, fidgeting with a pen on the table. "And I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously." The man raised an eyebrow. "Do you? Because serious usually means admitting mistakes and making changes, not just saying the right things to avoid bad press." The chief nodded quickly. "Of course. We've already placed the officer involved on administrative leave pending an investigation. We're also reviewing our training protocols to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." "That's a start," the man replied, crossing his arms. "But actions speak louder than promises. If you're serious about fixing this, then show us. Let the community see the steps you're taking to address bias and misconduct. Otherwise, all this talk is meaningless." By the time the meeting ended, the department had agreed to several key measures: mandatory racial sensitivity training for all officers, independent oversight during investigations of misconduct, and regular town halls where residents could voice concerns directly to leadership. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As they left the building, his daughter glanced up at him. "Do you think it'll actually make a difference?" He paused, considering her question. "It has to," he said finally. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step counts, and today we took one together." For the first time in days, she smiled, a small but hopeful smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew one thing for sure: She wasn't fighting alone anymore. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for the girl. On one hand, she felt relieved that her dad had stepped in and fought so fiercely for her. The police department was finally taking steps to address what had happened, and people across the community were talking about fairness and accountability. But on the other hand, the incident lingered in her mind like an unwelcome shadow. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being accused or the sting of the officer's mocking words. It was the way it made her question herself. At night, she'd lie awake replaying the scene over and over again. What if her dad hadn't been able to come home? What if no one had believed her? Those thoughts gnawed at her, making it hard to focus during the day. She tried going back to school, but even walking down the same streets felt different now. Every glance from a stranger seemed heavier, every interaction tinged with doubt. Her dad noticed. He could see it in the way she picked at her food during dinner or avoided eye contact when they talked. One evening, after finding her sitting alone in her room staring blankly at the wall, he decided it was time to have a real conversation. "Hey," he said softly, knocking lightly on her door before stepping inside. "Can I sit?" She shrugged, scooting over to make space for him on her bed. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, almost hesitantly, she broke the silence. "Do you think people will ever stop looking at me differently?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. "Probably not everyone," he admitted honestly. "Some folks are quick to judge based on what they see instead of who you really are. But that doesn't mean their opinions define you. You're stronger than all of that." She looked at him skeptically. "It doesn't feel like it sometimes." "I know," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "And it's okay to feel angry or hurt. What happened wasn't fair, and nobody should expect you to just get over it. But bottling it up won't help either. Sometimes, letting yourself feel those emotions is the first step toward healing." Over the next few days, he encouraged her to try therapy, not as a way to fix her, but as a safe place to process everything she'd been through. At first, she resisted, unsure if talking to a stranger would do any good. But after sitting in on a session with her, where the counselor explained how trauma could affect someone without them realizing it, she began to open up. Slowly, she started sharing her feelings about the incident, about the officer's words, and about the lingering fear she carried with her everywhere. Through therapy, she also discovered new ways to cope. Writing became her outlet. Late at night, when sleep eluded her, she'd grab a notebook and pour her thoughts onto paper. Some nights, it was poetry, raw, emotional verses that captured her pain and frustration. Other times, it was essays detailing her experience, hoping that putting it into words might help her make sense of it all. One evening, her dad found her typing furiously on her laptop. Curious, he peeked over her shoulder and saw the title of the document. "What happened to me, and why it matters." "What's this?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her. "It's kind of like a letter," she explained, pausing to look at him. "To anyone else who's gone through something like this. I figured maybe sharing my story online could help people know they're not alone." Her dad smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "That's a brave thing to do," he said. "Aren't you sure you're ready for that?" She nodded thoughtfully. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did. If telling my story helps even one person, then it's worth it." With her dad's support, she posted her writing online. Almost immediately, responses poured in, from strangers thanking her for speaking out to others sharing their own stories of injustice. Reading those comments gave her a strange mix of validation and hope. For the first time since the incident, she didn't feel quite so isolated. As the weeks turned into months, she began to find small victories in everyday life. Walking past the police station no longer filled her with dread. Conversations with friends felt lighter, less forced. And though the scars of the experience remained, she learned to carry them differently, not as weights holding her down, but as reminders of how far she'd come. Her dad watched her transformation with quiet admiration. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but seeing her resilience gave him faith that she'd continue to rise above whatever challenges came her way. Together, they proved that even in the face of adversity, love, courage, and determination could light the path forward. Months had passed since the incident, and life for the girl and her father began to settle into a new rhythm. The wounds were still there, but they no longer felt raw. Instead, they became part of her story. a chapter she could look back on with strength rather than shame. What started as a painful experience turned into something unexpected: purpose. The more she shared her writing online, the more people responded. Her words resonated with others who had faced similar struggles, people who felt dismissed, judged, or mistreated simply because of who they were. Messages poured in from all over the country, each one thanking her for giving voice to their pain and frustration. Some wrote about being stopped by police without cause, others talked about being stereotyped at school or work. Reading these stories opened her eyes to just how widespread these issues were and how much work still needed to be done. One day, while scrolling through her inbox, she came across an email that caught her attention. It was from a local community group inviting her to speak at a rally focused on justice reform. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't exactly her thing, and the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people made her stomach churn. But then she remembered why she'd started writing in the first place, to let others know they weren't alone. If sharing her story could inspire even one person to keep fighting, wasn't it worth stepping out of her comfort zone? When she told her dad about the invitation, he didn't push her one way or the other. "It's your call," he said simply. "But if you decide to do it, I'll be right there beside you." With his encouragement, she accepted the invitation. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly on her speech, rewriting it countless times until every word felt true to her heart. On the morning of the rally, she stood backstage, clutching a piece of paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her dad noticed her nervousness and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he whispered. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants to hear." When her name was called, she took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, but she barely heard it. All she could focus on was the microphone in front of her and the faces looking up at her, faces filled with hope, anger, sadness, and determination. For a moment, she froze, unsure where to begin. Then she looked down at her notes, found her opening line, and started to speak. "This isn't just my story," she began, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each sentence. "It's everyone's story. A story about what happens when we're treated unfairly, not because of what we've done, but because of assumptions made about who we are. And it's also a story about resilience, about refusing to stay silent when things aren't right." As she spoke, she saw heads nodding in agreement, tears streaming down some faces, and fists raised in solidarity. By the time she finished, the entire crowd was on its feet, cheering loudly. For the first time in months, she felt truly powerful, not because of what she'd been through, but because of what she was doing now, turning her pain into action. After the rally, people approached her to shake her hand, hug her, or simply thank her for speaking up. One woman handed her a small note that read, "Your courage gives me hope." She tucked it into her pocket, knowing it would remind her why she kept going. Inspired by the response, she decided to take her advocacy further. With her dad's guidance, she applied to colleges with programs focused on social justice and criminal justice reform. She dreamed of working alongside organizations dedicated to creating fairer systems, ones that protected instead of punished, listened instead of assumed. Her dad watched her transformation with pride. Though he'd always known she was strong, seeing her channel her experiences into meaningful change filled him with awe. Together, they continued using their voices to fight for fairness, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved better. At another rally months later, she stood beside her dad, holding the microphone confidently. Looking out at the sea of faces before her, she smiled. "We can rewrite the ending," she said firmly, "and we will together." In that moment, she realized something important. The fight for justice wasn't just hers or her dad's. It belonged to everyone willing to stand up, speak out, and demand change. And as long as there were people ready to join the fight, the future held endless possibilities.